Okay, let's bow our heads for a word of prayer. Father, we ask that you would be with us now as we look at a story, a scene that's really not very pretty. But we pray that you would help us to learn, help us to understand, help us to be quick to take lessons to ourselves and slow, or at least very, very careful to apply them to anyone else. Pray for your wisdom now in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, the Alpha. What is this? This is Tuesday. So Sunday night we dealt with the good Kellogg. And then last night was spent more or less just trying to establish the magnitude of the impact of this one individual, both on the good side and on the bad side. And so now we're going to turn to the story of the bad Kellogg. It's a very sad story. It is instructive. There's lessons we learned, and so I guess we ought to try and do that. Subtitle here, Anything But God. You know, that's what the human heart is comfortable with, basically. Anything else. Anything else. Well, let's see. We kind of touched on this some last night, but let's just pick up a little bit here. I have light from the Lord that Dr. Kellogg needs to be guarded. He is leaving a wrong impression on minds. He has made a mistake in supposing that the medical missionary work has an importance above every other work. Medical missionary work has its place, but it has been made disproportionately important. Now, it is important to notice the wording here, disproportionately important. I think we have in this presentation another statement later on. Certainly Ellen White made another statement a little later on, where she was speaking to conference officials, and she said, "You act like his work is disproportionately large." And she said, "That's because you're not doing anything." You're not doing enough. But here, this is a different issue. It's not a matter of the size of the work here. Kellogg was making it disproportionately important. The only thing that mattered, in other words, more or less. And that's not where it should be. But, you know, from cause to effect, right? How come he came to feel this way? Well, had Dr. Kellogg's brethren stood with him in the first of his experience in connection with health reform, the present condition of things would not now exist. You know, we need to be careful how we deal with people. People are, they are not a reproducible experiment. You know, in chemistry, you know, you mix some of this and you mix some of that and it blows up. Yeah, that's cool. Let's try that again. Yeah, you mix some of this and you mix some of that and it blows up again. Okay, it happens, you know, and you can say, oh, let's put more of this in and a little less of that. Oh, it didn't blow up that. Oh, okay, you know, you can do that sort of stuff, but you can't do that with people. You blow them up once and you never get the pieces back together. You know, you hurt their feelings. You prejudice them against you. You destroy your influence. It's hard to get back. As opposition to Kellogg's work continued year after year, it gave the devil opportunity to tempt him to impatience and pride. The Lord was sending him warnings. Ellen White was sending him these letters, right? But the doctor was listening less and less. Didn't just one day say, yeah, I've had enough of you, but he just responded less and less. The Lord has sent you warnings, but you have not heeded them. The deceptive power of the enemy has led you to leave God's banner trailing in the dust, while Dr. Kellogg has committed himself as working undenominationally in a work which taken the money from the people who are decidedly a denominational people. At the time, see, the sanitarium, originally it was incorporated as the Western Health Reform Institute in the 1860s, but Michigan, at that time at least, had a law that said the charter of incorporation for an organization could not last for more than 30 years. So in the later 1990s, something had to happen, or the whole thing would cease to legally exist. And so what happened is that the original corporation was sold to a newly created corporation. And that way you got another 30 years, okay? But when that new organization was put together, Kellogg wrote the Constitution, the bylaws of it, and included the thought that it was to function undenominationally. At the time, no one noticed. A few years later, they began to catch wind of this, or say, undenominational. We're not undenominational. It does not appear that any of them really understood what was going on. When Kellogg wrote that in there, it was not because he was trying to pull away from the denomination at that time. It was because he was hoping to be recognized by the American Medical Association, because he'd just started his medical college. And the AMA was refusing to acknowledge any medical college that had denominational ties. And so he was trying to accommodate their requirements. He later found it very convenient that it was listed as undenominational when he got to the point where he was, more standoffish from the denomination. But anyhow, nonetheless, basically, since Kellogg found it hard to work with the church, he put less effort into the evangelistic aspect of things and spent more time, more money just helping people with their health, period, as a physical issue. This made him feel good. It does make you feel good to help other people. It's more blessed to give than to receive, even if that's just physical health. But it wasn't blessing the people beyond the physical level, and it wasn't the work that God intended. Right? So this letter goes on, Ellen White writing, she says, "The work has been hindered. The cause of God should have a different showing, far different. And who is to blame for this hindrance? You give heed to men not of our faith. You delight to show what you have done, and by a free use of money that was not yours to handle in a way that God has not appointed." That right there, that men not of our faith, is perhaps the clearest indication that anyone, and that was Ellen White, had any idea about the AMA pressure that was going on at the time. There was a whole fascinating episode that took place in regard to the building in Chicago. I don't have time to go into this, but if you're familiar with the Kellogg's, it was his major attack on Ellen White for the next 40 years, is that she wrote to him and said, "You've spent too much money on a building you put up in Chicago." And he had not put up a building in Chicago. They had plans to put up a building in Chicago, pretty much exactly like she had described. It had not been built. And so Kellogg ignored the fact that she'd stopped him from doing something that he shouldn't do, and he should have been grateful for that. And he used that, kind of timing aspect. She was warned in advance and spoke of it as if it had been done. And he said, he never talked about the fact that they had plans. He just said, "We never put up a building. There's no such thing." That was his major attack. What people don't generally realize is what that building was for and why it was going to go up. The building was going to be a clinical hospital, and it was required by the AMA in order to get their certification. 17 years later, exactly the same issue transpired out in California at Loma Linda. And the AMA was saying, you have to have a 250-bed hospital downtown Los Angeles, when Ellen White had already said there should be nothing built down in Los Angeles. So anyhow, there were lessons to be learned all the way along. Anyhow, 1902, the sanitarium burnt to the ground. That was a major blow. They lost a lot of money. They had some insurance, but not enough to cover it. Dr. Kellogg was given, through this tragedy, an excellent opportunity to move the sanitarium out of Battle Creek and to split it up. Instead of having one monstrous big operation, could have been 5, even 10 littler ones scattered around the country, which Ellen White had been advocating for a number of years. But he didn't do that. I think it's, I don't have this in his words, but I think it's obvious that the reason he didn't is because he recognized that maintaining explicit personal control over a single institution would be a lot easier than trying to maintain control over 10 institutions scattered around the country. And he was, at this point, intent on maintaining control. There's an interesting side lesson on the fire. The fire department had inspected it the day before, and everything was ship-shape, and it burned down anyhow. They didn't have air conditioning in those days, but they had these ventilation shafts that went all the way vertical up and down, and the fire started right next to one of those and went right up the shaft very rapidly and spread to all the floors in like 10, 15 minutes or something or less. The nurses performed heroically, and they managed to get every single patient out of the building. The majority of the patients would have been ambulatory, so they could have walked out on their own, but some certainly were not. There was only one fatality, a Mr. Case. He was evacuated. He was across the street, standing in a snowbank in McCamley Park, along with everybody else. And all of a sudden, he said, "My mattress!" He went running back into the fire to get his mattress. It wasn't just the mattress. He had his life savings stashed in the mattress. That's what was going to keep him for the rest of his life. And I guess the good news is that it did. You might want to think carefully about what you're willing to risk your life, okay? In more ways than just running into a burning building. But anyhow. Well, so Kellogg decided to rebuild. He determined to build, in some ways, bigger. In some ways, he was pretty crafty about this. Some dimensions of the building were smaller than the old one, so he could say, no, we're not building as big as we had before. Other dimensions were larger. The rooms were certainly larger inside there. He had fewer rooms. He had fewer rooms, but he had bigger and fancier rooms. It was going to be expensive, though, and so he needed to raise some funds, and he came up with an idea. He suggested it to the General Conference. And the General Conference at this point was strapped for cash, largely because of Kellogg's misadventure with the Boulder Sanitarium in Colorado that had drained the coffers to an unfortunate degree. And so when the sanitarium burned down, the General Conference was like, oh man, we don't have the money. You know, what's going to happen here? We don't have the money. And Kellogg came and he suggested a plan. He said, I've written a book. Just finishing up this book. And here's what I'd like to do. I will donate my royalties. Anything that I would normally get from the book, I will donate it to rebuilding the sanitarium. Let's ask the Review and Herald to print it at cost and donate their portion. And then let's ask our church members to sell it and donate their cut of the deal, so to speak. And let's let all that go to rebuilding the sanitarium. And, the General Conference Committee, actually in the committee notes, they said it was a splendid idea. I mean, how are you going to get the money, right? You got to do something. And so the book was, finished up. I think he wasn't quite done writing it yet. Finished up spring of 1902. Some galley proofs were pulled, and different people looked through them a little bit. there began to be rumblings that there was some weird stuff in the book. The term that's always been used pretty much is pantheism. Some technical theoreticians on the subject would make a distinction. It was perhaps not pantheism, it was panentheism, which is almost identical. It's hardly worth making a distinction. And it was extremely mild. I will guarantee I can find vastly worse examples of pantheism in any non-Adventist health food store you happen to point me to a literature rack. Now, I'm assuming it was mild. Let's put it that way, okay? I've only read about 4 paragraphs of the book, and those are the samples that people have pulled and said, this is pantheism. So I'm assuming that they went to the trouble of pulling the worst stuff. I don't know. I haven't read the book. I'm not going to read the book for a very simple reason. Ellen White said, don't read the book. So I'm not going to read the book. But anyhow, so there were these elements of pantheism or panentheism, which is the belief that God is in everything. The material world, the universe, that's God. You'll find that today in various forms and configurations and different names at times, but that's basically the idea. So what's wrong with pantheism? Well, pantheism is basically the core fundamental teaching of Hinduism. In recent decades, long since Kellogg, it has been modernized and repackaged somewhat and shipped over to the Western world in ways that don't sound quite so jarring to the Western mind, I suppose. The claim of pantheism is that it brings the sense of God close, because in everything we see God. Yeah, okay. Whatever. The problem is that in everything it brings God close and it puts God within me, because I'm part of the universe. And so I have God in me. You have God in you, too. One of the more notable advocates of this kind of thing, a non-Adventist guy, right? He said, if only we understood the reality, I suppose the problem would be that every time we met, we would worship each other. Okay, whatever. Anyhow, and it's sort of logical, right? I mean, if I've got God in me, you probably ought to worship me, you know? And if you've got God in you, I probably ought to worship you. But more to the point, if I've got God in me, why do I have to worry about some old book? I mean, I've got a question, I just kind of ask myself, right? I mean, I have to develop the deity within, is the way it goes. Well, so the book was, like I said, the galley proofs were distributed around. There were rumblings and concern. September of 1902, the question was advocated and discussed at a meeting at the General Conference headquarters in in Battle Creek. It was, General Conference in Battle Creek. And there were some who thought Living Temple was a wonderful book, and some who had misgivings over it. Eventually, they spun the job off to a subcommittee of 4 individuals. Kellogg, Paulson, McGann, and W.W. Prescott. And quite unusual within Adventist circles, the committee came back to the General Conference session with 2 reports. Kellogg, Paulson, and McGann said, yeah, we think it's a great book. Prescott said, aside from the pure physiological aspect of it, it's the most dangerous thing I've ever seen, and I pray it will never be printed. Well, that didn't make for smooth, simple discussion on the floor of the General Conference. And so there was a bit of a knockdown, drag-out over it, and eventually the General Conference committee said, nah, we're not gonna deal with this. And so Kellogg, of course, took it like, yeah, why am I not surprised? Of course they're not going to put any money into it. So he took the book, and he, instead of having it printed through the General Conference, he went to the printer himself. And he said, hey, would you print this book for me? And the nice people at the Review and Herald said, sure, we'll print it. Because it was a private job. It wasn't a conference job, no, it was a private job. So that was like late September 1902. They had to do the typesetting, one thing and another. The plates, the printing plates were on the floor of the press room on December 30, the night of 30/31, I think it was, 1902, when the Review and Herald burnt down. And that was, another blow to the church, right? And to Kellogg. Anyhow, as I said last night, to me, one of the most amazing things about the whole time period was this, and we read this last night. This is now 1903, right? After the sanitarium fire and the book and all the discussion in September and the rejection by the General Conference and the Review burning down the day before they were going to print the book, after all that, Ellen White is still trying to hang on to Dr. Kellogg, right? God does not endorse the efforts put forth by different ones to make the work of Dr. Kellogg as hard as possible in order to build themselves up. God gave the light on health reform, and those who rejected it rejected God. One and another who knew better said it all came from Dr. Kellogg and made war upon him. This had a bad influence on the doctor. He put on the coat of irritation and retaliation. God did not want him to stand in a position of warfare, and he does not want you to stand there. Well, Ellen White was trying very, very hard to hang on to the man. Unfortunately, Kellogg was not responding well to her efforts. As time went on, actually at that General Conference, Ellen White tried 3 times to address the question of pantheism. 3 different occasions. She sent the word out. She said, I want all the doctors and ministers to have an early morning meeting. And 3 times she came walking in and had a manuscript in her hand, and she walked to the podium, and she looked at the audience, congregation, and she put the manuscript in her carrying bag, whatever thing that she had, and she pulled up her Bible, and she'd say, let's turn to John chapter 5. And she would just have a nice devotional talk. The Lord just stopped her 3 times in a row. She kept thinking, no, I've got to address this, and the Lord stopped her. When it finally was time to address the pantheism, Ellen White was clear as to its dangers. Notice here, just to make sure everybody's on the same page with us here, we're going to be using the terminology of alpha and omega, okay? And the thing to note is that the alpha is the first letter of the Greek alphabet, right? Alpha, beta, gimel, ain. So that's where we get our word alphabet. So alpha is the first letter, and down the other end is the omega. Okay? So this is what Jesus said, I'm the alpha and the omega, the first and the last, right? So that's where this terminology comes from, right? Many will depart from the faith, giving heed to seducing spirits and doctrines of devils. We have now before us the alpha of this danger. The omega will be of a most startling nature. Okay? She's talking, I don't have enough context for you to really see it, but she's talking about Kellogg's apostasy and specifically the book Living Temple. Living Temple contains the alpha of these theories. I knew that the omega would follow in a little while, and I trembled for our people. In the book Living Temple, there is presented the alpha of deadly heresies. The omega will follow and will be received by those who are not willing to heed the warning God has given. You know, it's interesting, though. She doesn't specify exactly what that warning is. My guess, because there's nothing in the context, there's no specific warning in that context that I can easily point to. My guess as to what she's perhaps talking about right here, maybe, is a real simple one. Don't read the book. Don't read the book. Don't dabble with that stuff. Of course, today we'd have to add thousands of other books and thousands of YouTube videos and thousands of whatever this is and whatever that's. You know, the media is saturated with this stuff. Anyhow, some more thoughts here from Ellen White. As I am shown these special things of Satan's science and how he deceived the holy angels, I am afraid of the men who have entered into the study of the science that Satan carried into the warfare in heaven. Oh, how I have longed to be where I should not be compelled to see the same science practiced on this earth by medical practitioners. How my heart has been agonized. I have seen souls accepting the inducements held out to them to unite with those who were warring against God. Not a good thing. We have reached the perils of the last days, when some, yes, many, shall depart from the faith, giving heed to seducing spirits and doctrines of devils. Be cautious in regard to what you read and how you hear. I think that's another way of saying don't read the book. Take not a particle of interest in spiritualistic theories. Satan is waiting to steal a march upon everyone who allows himself to be deceived by his hypnotism. He begins to exert his power over them just as soon as they begin to investigate his theories. Now, this was a serious concern for me, because out there on the little table there by the doorway is a book called Tremble, which, remember she said, the Omega would come and I tremble for our people. That's where that title comes from. And it deals with Kellogg's apostasy and the contemporary elements of that, which are increasingly annoying to the Adventist Church. So how do you write a book without, investigating theories? I had to decide, what do you do? And so I didn't make it as obvious, perhaps. Maybe I should have in Tremble. But in Tactics, my more recent book, that's exactly what I did. It came more clear to me, I guess. I followed Ellen White's lead. She never analyzed the theories of pantheism. She did speak about what they did, the tactics that were used, the actions, the methods. Not the theories, the methods. So I tried to stick with that. And that's why I talk about what I talk about, and I don't go into any big in-depth interpretations or discussions of pantheism. Actually, she told the folks at the review, she said, don't publish articles about that stuff. Don't even publish articles trying to show that it's wrong. Because in order to go to the trouble of showing that it's wrong, you have to show what it says. And in showing what it says, you're spreading it. Don't do that. So, if that's the way it's to be dealt with, don't read the book. I think that's kind of clear. One other thing I'll just throw in right now for what it's worth. Kellogg's writings are dangerous. Just plain dangerous. Not only because of pantheism. he's just dangerous. He could make things sound so good for his side. So obvious, so simple, so clear, so heart-rendingly something or the other. I'd read a few things that he'd written, enough to know that, but only like I'd run into over the years, I'd run into a letter here or a letter there that I managed to latch onto that Kellogg had written somewhere or the other. But more recently, a lot of materials have become available, a lot of Kellogg's materials. The collection of his papers is at University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, and it's all online now. The collection of his correspondence is at Michigan State University here in Lansing, and it's not online, but it's available. And a lot of his letters are available, the letters that he wrote to Ellen White are available in what's known as the incoming correspondence file, which was released in 2015 along with those other things. And so I had to try and figure out, how am I going to deal with this stuff? Do I want to read this? And I'll tell you what I did, just to be honest. I won't guarantee that I did the smartest thing, the wisest thing. I think I did what God would have me do, but I don't claim to have that level of absolute certainty. What I did was I read everything that Ellen White wrote to or about Dr. Kellogg from 1892 to 1907, 15 years. Took me about 7 months of serious reading, sometimes 4 hours a day. I had no idea she'd written that much, or I might not have been so ambitious. But I read through everything that she had to say on the topic before I read Kellogg's stuff. And all I can say is it was none too much. It was none too cautious. Because the guy's terribly persuasive. And if you don't have the answer to what he's doing, if you don't have the other side of the story, I tell you, he will suck you in. just a thought. You will find other people like that. You might want to just, be cautious in sometimes. Okay. I'm going to have to go more quickly here. Suffer not yourselves to open the lids of a book that is questionable. There is a hellish fascination in the literature of Satan. It is a powerful battery by which he tears down a simple religious faith. Never feel that you are strong enough to read infidel books, for they contain a poison like that of asps. They can do you no good and will assuredly do you harm. In reading them, you are inhaling the miasmas of hell. That's not a good recommendation, is it? Okay, well... It's no wonder Lucifer's story explains so much about Kellogg's apostasy, and there's so many parallels. It turns out that Kellogg's apostasy was choreographed by the same choreographer. No greater deception could be presented to the minds of men than the representation you have made of God. Souls will be lost through the sowing of the statements found in Living Temple. In presenting error, you have united with the Prince of Darkness. When you wrote that book, you were not under the inspiration of God. There was by your side the one who inspired Adam to look at God in a false light. You have been the spokesman, repeating the words of accusation and condemnation of the arch deceiver. Your science has been used to benumb the sensibilities and confuse the judgment of others. In long night talks, you have presented your mind and plans and works, and these have become their mind and plan and works. In listening to your words, these men have imbibed the very science of the tempter. You have twisted and manipulated and misstated and misrepresented the testimonies that God has given, making them of no effect. Now, remember when we were talking about Lucifer, I said that the idea of planting a seed of doubt and then going around and coming back and re-engaging in conversation and getting the angels to repeat. That's the one thing that she hits on Lucifer more than any other, over and over and over. This is what she talks about with Kellogg, these long night talks. There's a lesson to be learned there. I don't know who's going to need it or when, I may need it someday, but Kellogg would buttonhole somebody and get them off to one side, and he'd talk at them from like 9 o'clock at night until 2 in the morning and just wear them down. They're oh, yeah, doctor, yeah, sure, yeah, I agree, yeah. Can I go to bed? And the problem is that he would get them to agree. And again, what comes out of your mouth, your brain thinks you believe. Anyhow, going on. The whole matter has been presented to me. You have worked as Lucifer worked in the heavenly courts to persuade his associates to unite with him. The enemy has used his arts upon your mind, your boasted study of science, and your assertion that you have obtained something excellent, have deceived the men connected with you, and they have refused to listen to the warnings sent to keep them from listening to your false representations. There were a fair number who lost their way because of Kellogg. When I was in Tacoma Park, living in Carroll House, many things were presented to me in vision. One of them, a committee meeting held during the night hours in the Battle Creek Sanitarium. The meeting was conducted by Dr. Kellogg. Many of the physicians were present, and W.C. White, having been sent for to attend a special council, was reined up in this committee. I mean, they ganged up on him. Oh, what agony of mind I suffered as I was viewing the way in which Dr. Kellogg conducted that meeting. I may sometime describe it, but not now. I haven't found that she ever did describe it, but Willie did. So we have his account, and we can kind of see. And it was one of those long night talks. It stretched till 2 o'clock in the morning. She goes on, I have told Willie that if ever plans were made for him to go into another night session with Dr. Kellogg, and I knew it, I would certainly exercise all the power God would give me to break up such an interview. Evil angels were there, and if the physicians present had had their true senses about them, they would have understood the spirit and influence of the actions of Dr. Kellogg and of the words spoken by him on that occasion. This matter of powering thoughts into others' minds doesn't always have to be done in person. And a lot of people stay up every night watching TV. I'm not sure it's any better. Okay, let's go on. It would have been better for Dr. Kellogg if he had never been born. If he continues to build himself up in his own magical arts of mind in influencing other minds, what chapters of experience will be opened before the universe of heaven? The light will reveal every phase of his companionship with satanic agencies. I know the seducing power of Dr. Kellogg's advisor, and I have no other name to give it but the seductive influence of satanic agencies. Dr. Kellogg is dealt in this influence to a greater or less degree. He has not changed except to be more secretive. I have not one ray of hope regarding him unless he understands that through satanic agencies he is striving for power over human minds. This has been shown me. Power over human minds. Probably the most blatant forms of that would be the latest and greatest advanced forms of hypnotism. Yeah, they're real stuff. It's dangerous stuff. Ericksonian hypnosis is one name. Neurolinguistic programming is another name. They are dangerous. Dr. Kellogg is linked up with the great deceiver. He has not realized what he was doing, any more than the angels who fell realized what they were doing, but he has tempted Satan to tempt him. He has studied hypnotism and spiritualism for the purpose of bringing minds to endorse sentiments that mean a denial of the faith once delivered to the saints. He has not entered upon this work all at once, but by degrees. He has ensnared his own mind and capabilities. He would now resort to any device rather than to humble his heart before God and to acknowledge his wrong. Kellogg objected to this. He says, I have never studied hypnotism. I have never studied spiritualism. I have never had a book like that in my possession. He might be telling the truth there. I don't know. I can't prove it one way or the other. his denial rings true to a certain degree because everything else you see about him, he was just really locked on to his medical studies. He didn't pay attention to anything else. But if he wasn't reading books on hypnotism and spiritualism, I trust Ellen White, he was still studying it. And perhaps directly under the tutelage of Satan. So he may not have known it. Somehow, something, I don't know. Some things I don't have every detail on. But that is a big issue. And this was a huge part of what Ellen White referred to as the alpha. I cannot possibly imagine the omega without these things being present. And so I talk about them by way of warning. I have seen Dr. Kellogg exerting a hypnotic influence upon persons, and at such times the arch deceiver was his helper. Those who sustain him, remember his associates, right? Those who sustain him are guilty with him. This blindness of understanding is a strange thing in our ranks. Dr. Kellogg places himself in the position of one who is abused because he cannot carry everything with him, but he is still at work with all subtlety. I have warned our people, for they do not understand his underhand secretive working, and he works with such ingenuity to obtain sympathy that to many his words seem genuine. Okay, so this thing about he cannot carry everything with him, it means he wasn't getting what he wanted in committee meetings, basically is what that boils down to. He presented himself as one who is abused. That's the classic appeal to sympathy. Why? How come everybody's picking on me? Ellen White just doesn't understand. I love Ellen White. She's like a mother to me, but she just doesn't understand that these things these people are telling her are not true. Yeah, you can generate a lot of sympathy that way. And, one of the things that's actually kind of scary is that, well, not quite this late in the game, but about 1903, 04, even into 05, Kellogg was very close, I would judge, from reading the letters going back and forth. Kellogg was very close to getting George Butler and Stephen Haskell on his side. Not on pantheism. That's one thing but on his objections to the General Conference and the way his portrayals of how everybody's always picking on me. And Butler and Haskell were really quite sympathetic, and it's spooky to read their letters. There is something that saved them, and we'll touch on that in a bit, though. Okay, let's see. Let's go on. This is interesting. There's a time for silence here. From 1903, the fall of 1903 especially, onward, Kellogg was a real thorn in the side of the General Conference leadership, especially A.G. Daniels. In 1903, Kellogg floated the idea of reopening the Battle Creek College. They'd shut down the college and they'd moved it out to Berrien Springs, right? But they didn't actually move Battle Creek College. They kind of just shut this one down and they started a new one, which meant that the legal charter for Battle Creek College was still available. And Kellogg needed Adventist young people to work at low wages in the sanitarium. And so he thought, well, if I start a school here, we can, give them some schooling and they can pay it off through the sanitarium, and this will be a win-win type of thing. And Ellen White was saying, don't send your kids to Battle Creek. It's not a safe spiritual environment. Just don't. And Kellogg was saying, hey, we have some great educational opportunities here, and you can save a lot of money if you come here and go to school. And people were sending their kids. And this was really burning up Daniels. And he would write these letters to Sister White. He'd say, "Oh, Sister White, they're killing us. You got to do something. You're the only one. If you would just make it clear, the people, the church members, they would respect you. You're the only one with the voice of authority that can deal with this. Please say something." And she kept saying, "We need to work to try and save Dr. Kellogg. Let's not make a big issue now." The most classic one she wrote to Daniels and Prescott, and she said, "Try not to include too many articles in the review that will stir up strife with the doctor." Well, how many are too many? How many are too many? What can we say? What can't we say? Daniels writes back and he says, "We would love to drop the whole thing. We'd love to avoid the whole controversy. We speak of it, if at all, only with whispers. But they are not dropping it. The sanitarian people, they're going everywhere. They're mailing out letters. They're working underhanded." He says, "And don't tell me, no one can tell me that it's not affecting our young people. We're losing the flower of our youth." He said, "When a father refuses to recommend his son for an honorable position with the conference as a physician with the conference because the father says his son has become an infidel at the sanitarium," he says, "you can't tell me there's not a problem." And he wrote this long, impassioned letter, and the last line said, "I beg your forgiveness if I have said anything wrong or a single word out of line," something like that. Because he didn't know how to deal with Kellogg because Ellen White was not giving him a green light, so to speak. And then it happened. And again, much like the Meet It experience that you're probably familiar with, the vision of the ship in the fog and all that sort of thing, Ellen White was awakened on the 21st of December, 1905, and she was instructed, "Get these manuscripts together, send a telegram to A.G. Daniels, tell him to go to Battle Creek and wait for the manuscripts to come in the mail." And Daniels got there on the 26th of December. The night before, Kellogg had had a long night talk from 5 to 11, I guess it was, with a whole bunch of people in which he had pretty blatantly, openly disavowed the spirit of prophecy. He started off by saying how wonderful Ellen White was. He loved her. She'd done wonderful, great things. The Lord used her. And then, as it was said, he, by many infallible proofs, showed that you couldn't trust everything that came out with her name on it because people were influencing and manipulating the testimonies. And the next morning, on the 26th, the packet of documents arrives from Ellen White with a manuscript that she had written almost 2 years before, which included the words that were spoken the night before in that meeting. And that's really what broke the back of Kellogg's movement. So a time for silence, right? Some thought the time had come long ago to make a determined effort to break the spell and expose the deception. For years, one and still another of Dr. Kellogg's men have stood forth claiming that Dr. Kellogg is all right, that he teaches the message as we believe it, that he believes the testimonies. But at the same time, a work of misrepresentation was going on, and many of our people were becoming spiritually deceived. To those who urged immediate action, I said, wait until Dr. Kellogg himself and those closely allied with him take an open stand. Then be all prepared with matter ready to print. Notice the tactical approach here. She knows, and the Lord has told her, when to pull the trigger, so to speak. Okay? That's very tactical. That's where this wise generalship comes in that the Lord is calling for. But I was shown that our brethren must make no move until Dr. Kellogg and associates had taken a decided position to repudiate the testimonies. When this was done, we must show our people the right side and take the affirmative in the name of the Lord. We had to move, and yet we had to wait. until those in error thought they could carry things against the ministers and churches. I was shown their course of action and had everything in readiness for such a movement and labored to defeat their deep-laid plot. A plot is an interesting thing. This is not just a misguided series of actions or a misguided effort. This is an intentional thing. This is a plot. Just thought I'd notice that. Going on. Friends of the doctor were visiting our churches, acting as spies to work up a sentiment favorable to his interests. They claimed that he was in perfect harmony with the message as we believe it, and that he believed the testimonies, a work of deception was being carried on. Many of our people were becoming confused. I said to those who urged immediate action, did I read this already? Did I go backwards? Yeah, I guess it's a little bit different. It will be better to wait until Dr. Kellogg and his associates take the position that they do not believe the testimonies. When this time comes, we are to be prepared with suitable matter for publication to meet the issue. It's very similar, but it's not exactly the same, I guess. This was done. Meetings were held in Battle Creek on the night of December 25. Apparently, Adventists didn't observe Christmas much. The meetings were held in Battle Creek at which the testimonies were presented in a very objectionable light. The testimonies were practically repudiated, but matter was ready for publication, and it had been mailed 5 days before. Our people on the right side took a strong affirmative position in the name of the Lord, and the widespread deception was arrested. One of the leaders in Battle Creek said that the lid of the kettle was lifted too soon, that had they waited a little longer, they might have had nearly all the churches on their side. Humanly speaking, I think that's right. They were winning the game. They just maybe pushed it a little bit too far, too fast, something. Whatever. Okay. Let's keep going. The sentiments in Living Temple regarding the personality of God have been received even by men who have had a long experience in the truth. When such men consent to eat the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, we are no longer to regard the subject as a matter to be treated with the greatest delicacy. That those whom we thought sound in the faith should have failed to discern the specious, deadly influence of this science of evil should alarm us, as nothing else has alarmed us. So there was a time to be silent, and there's a time to speak, right? That's something I need to work on, because sometimes I get it backwards. Sometimes I'm silent when I should be speaking. Sometimes I'm speaking when I should be silent. I'm not the wisest of generals. I've got a lot to learn yet. It is something that cannot be treated as a small matter that men who have had so much light and such clear evidence as to the genuineness of the truth we hold should become unsettled and led to accept spiritualistic theories regarding the personality of God. Well, there are a bunch of more details we might consider concerning the Alpha experience. There are a lot of additional tactics, legal issues, contracts, lawsuits, the structuring of organizations, misrepresentation, all these things I go through in the book, dealing with all the fine print, so to speak. But perhaps the main thought we can jump to is, that God warned us, He's told us about the good and the evil of the last days. He has granted humanity's choice that we be given what He wanted to protect us from. We asked for the knowledge of evil, right? So we're getting it. But the Lord's made every effort to prepare us for that. There was a interesting thing. I'm going to hide that one. I don't want you to see that yet. In 1972, the General Conference president was Robert Pearson, and he wrote a letter to the secretary of the Ellen G. White estate. That was Ellen White's grandson, Arthur White. I always had a lot of respect for Elder Pearson, and I gained it even more when I read of his inquiry. He wrote to the White estate and he said, "Is there anything more available to help me understand the Alpha and the Omega of apostasy? I'm worried." He didn't say I'm worried, but I'm adding that. It's kind of like, I don't want this to happen on my watch. I want to know. And so Arthur wrote back and said, no, there really wasn't. in a certain sense, I believe he was completely accurate. In a certain sense, I'll just be honest, and I think I've amassed some additional information. It's a lot easier now, Things are on computer. You can just do a computer search type of thing. It's a lot easier. I'm not faulting Elder Arthur White in any sense in that, but I do think that more information is more readily available now, and so we can piece together a little better picture. That's what I was trying to do. But it's interesting what he said about this. This is Arthur White's response to Elder Pearson now. As I went into our files in response to your request, I found a statement written by my father, W.C. White, about 1935, 1936. I think you will be interested in this, for he broadens the basis for the statements of the Alpha and Omega beyond that which one might conclude from just reading them as they are in the text. Here is my father's statement. Now, this is Willie White writing. He says, there is one matter which causes us some perplexity. It is that which Sister White has written regarding the Alpha and the Omega of efforts to mislead the people of God. It is clearly to be seen that the Alpha was the introduction of misleading documents and the effort to wrest the leadership of the denomination from the men chosen to bear heavy responsibility. It has always seemed to me that when the Omega came, it would bear two characteristics somewhat similar to the Alpha. The movement, designated as the Alpha, embraced a deep-laid plan on the part of the great adversary of truth to introduce false doctrine which struck at the very vitals of Christian belief. It also embraced a persistent and strongly sustained effort to wrest the leadership of this people from the General Conference Committee and place it in the hands of other men. We didn't really go into all that, but Kellogg was working to try and practically gain control of the entire church. With these things in mind, I cannot accept any movement that I have seen up to the present time as constituting the Omega. When the Omega does come, I shall expect to see something similar to the work of Dr. Kellogg and his associates when they labored so earnestly to undermine the confidence of all our people in the leadership of the General Conference. Well, how bad was it, right? How bad was it? Back to Ellen White now. My heart was filled with sorrow because of the course that J.H. Kellogg is following and A.T. Jones is following, the same course, and voicing the same sentiments with the most determined spirit. When a realization of this comes over me with such force, great sorrow fills my soul. I have before me such a revival of the first great apostasy in the heavenly courts that I am bowed down with an agony that cannot be expressed. And so this is what we've been leading up to, starting with Lucifer, and then Christ, good Kellogg, bad Kellogg. I hope you can see the parallelism. Lucifer's rebellion in heaven, 6,000 years ago, roughly, give or take, led to Christ's response on the opposition side, so to speak, on the defense. 1,800 years after Christ, the good Kellogg gathered up at least some of the concepts and the practices, the tactics of the blended ministry of preaching, teaching, helping, healing, and it led to the beginning of the loud cry. But then the good Kellogg, almost the covering cherub, he flipped, and he became the bad Kellogg. And that led to the alpha of apostasy. That's a lot for one person to be involved in. And yet, those two things, the beginning of the loud cry and the alpha of apostasy, have obvious implications for events yet future. There's lessons to be learned here. And so, in our next Wednesday, Thursday, 2 more meetings, we'll be looking at those things and trying to gain the lessons God has for us. And I'm all done.